Daily. You might recall we've had David Kupeli on here numerous times from WorldNet Daily. He entered the media world as a public relations assistant for the Seattle Mariners and a sports correspondent for Associated Press Radio. He served for 10 years in Eastern Europe with a Christian organization and earned a master's degree in communications from Wheaton College. And before joining WorldNet Daily, shortly after 9/11, he was the editor for the News Service Worldwide Newsroom and senior news writer for Christian. Unfortunately, I can't make the volume go up any higher. It's as high as it goes. Unless Bareface can figure something out, I can't turn it up. So, like I said, this was recorded literally on the phone. It wasn't recorded the way that we currently record stuff. So, Christianity Today magazine. And so Art is on the line too. So, hi, Art. Welcome back.
Hi, Stacy. Good to be with you again. As far as I can see from here, you haven't changed a bit in 10 years.
Well, I appreciate that. It's amazing what not being able to look at me does for you. Oh, that's okay. All right, so, first of all, congratulations. I want to say congratulations, because today is actually the release date for your book, right?
Yes, it is, Jeff.
All right, cool. All right, I'll tell you what we'll do, because I know that there's two of you, and so I'll just address you, so that way you don't step on each other. Does that sound like a good idea? That sounds like a plan.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right, so do you mind if I call you Phil, or would you like Philip instead?
No, I'm fine either way. That's good.
Okay. All right, well, first of all, I want to thank you for your service to America, doing what you did to help protect us, and I would love it if you told everybody just a little bit more about your background, because I always find it fascinating to find out why people, number one, want to work for the government, and number two, what happens actually when you do work for the government.
Well, I worked for the government before 9/11 as an entomologist, as a kind of a scientist in agriculture, and I traveled all over the world as a scientist, in particular in the Middle East. I worked in places like Egypt, in Yemen, in Eritrea, Jordan, Israel, different parts of the world where I saw things up close and personal. And of course, when you're there in a foreign country, it's always a good idea to try to learn the language, especially when you work with farmers, people out in the fields. That's the type of entomologist I was. But I was always interested in languages and in theology. So I studied the biblical languages, and I also studied Quranic Arabic while I was there working in the Middle East. And that gave me a first-hand introduction into the world of Islam. And I probably would still have been an entomologist today, except for 9/11. And as when 9/11 came, I talked to my Congressman Max Cleland from Georgia, and he recommended that I go to work for Tom Ridge, the first Secretary of what was then called the Office of Homeland Security, before it was even designated as a department. And I was in process of getting hired from them when I got another job offer with the Department of Agriculture at the Atlanta airport. And then after all that, I was drawn into the new agency called Department of Homeland Security in March of 2003 as an agricultural officer. That's how my career in science segued into the world of counterterrorism. Initially as an agricultural scientist, and then subsequently as a counterterrorism specialist.
Wow, that's amazing. I think that's an interesting journey there too, and I bet you a whole lot of people forgot about Tom Ridge because it's been so long ago.
Well, he was the first of what we've had so far, 4 Secretaries of Homeland Security. But yep, I was involved in the whole process immediately after 9/11, right up till I graduated in July 31st of 2015, last year. And the book is a story of that whole trajectory of events from the day that 9/11 happened until the last culminating events in the investigations that the government took out against me for basically doing my job.
I was talking to a neighbor of mine this morning who is a Vietnam vet, and who served our country well. And I was telling him that you're going to be on the show today, and I told him about how that happened, how here you are doing your job for the government, and next thing you know, they're investigating you. Like you're the bad guy. Like, what did you do? You didn't do anything. You didn't do anything wrong.
No, it wasn't for moral failure. It wasn't for abrogation of duty, failure to follow command, or anything like that. The first time I got investigated was in March, actually started in March of 2006, for writing an article, which is still available today on the World Wide Web, called Green Tide Rising, Hamas Ascends. Hamas being that globally designated terrorist organization we hear about all the time. I wrote an analysis of the Hamas after they were elected to take over the government of Gaza in 2006. Before it was all done, contractors for the CIA in a course that I took assumed that I had used classified information to write the article, and they turned me in to the DHS headquarters on the assumption or the charge that I had unethically accessed classified information to write the article. They didn't ask me directly, how did you come to these conclusions? They simply assumed that it would be impossible to come to such conclusions without having access to classified information. The article is still on the web to this very day. Anyone can go and look it up. Green Tide Rising, Hamas Ascends, and read for yourself. It sounds like it was written yesterday, not 10 years ago. But after 11 months of drama and trauma, I was exonerated. It took 11 months for them to do it.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you were exonerated. That's good. At least they did that, right? Okay.
Well, yeah, that's right. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
All I was going to say was that was only the beginning. What I thought maybe would have been a unique incident turned out to be the first of 9 different investigations that were conducted in the next several years of my career.
Okay. Well, I want you to talk a little bit more about that, but I want to bring Art here into the conversation. Art, you are a veteran reporter and for WorldNet Daily, and like I told our audience, 10 years ago, you interviewed me about pedophile bloggers, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
You were actually the one that actually took that story, which was awesome. But how did you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you met Phil so that we can learn about how you helped write the book here?
Sure. Yeah, I began with WND shortly after 9/11, actually. And right away, I began to see that groups like the Council on American Islamic Relations and other groups that made themselves out to be civil rights groups, these are people representing these groups show up on Fox News Channel, and they're always called upon whenever somebody needs to talk to a Muslim about what's happening in the news. And I began to realize that these groups are not what we might call mainstream civil rights groups. They, in fact, it turned out, and this evidence began to come out actually over the course of the 2000s after 9/11. Turns out, these groups actually were established by foreign entities, most of them by the Muslim Brotherhood, and most of these groups you find have leaders who, in many cases, have been prosecuted for terrorism-related crimes, even convicted. And so I began to dig deeper, and the short of it is that about 5 years ago, a mutual friend of Philip's and mine put us in contact with each other, and I had this initial phone call in which I listened for an hour to this man who thinks the way I do. He sees what's happening and much more. In fact, here's a guy who is right in the middle of the Department of Homeland Security, who is seeing all of this, and it was really remarkable to me. So we had a number of phone calls over the years, and then I found out just last year that he was retiring. So that's what put us together and eventually brought us to write this book.
That's good. Okay, so all right. So I want to let everybody know the name of the book, in case you didn't get it when I first mentioned it, is called "See Something, Say Nothing: A Homeland Security Officer Exposes the Government's Submission to Jihad." And of course, Phil, I bet you did that. You did that without there being there was a cost to you doing that. I'm sure of it because of what you just talked about earlier. But I would love it if you could talk now a little bit about the book and how you started off and what the main point you're trying to bring the reader into so that they understand what it's about.
The book starts out essentially with San Bernardino, and it ends with San Bernardino. One of the cases that I was working on during the course of my career was a large group, global level group called Tablighi Jamaat. Most people in the West have not heard them, but in the rest of the world they're known as the Army of Darkness. There are somewhere between 75 and 125 million members of this particular group that comes out of north central India originally, in a town called Deoband. The group is called Tablighi Jamaat. It means promoters of Islam. And I was working on it because they were coming into the country starting in about 2006 on a visa waiver program. And we noticed that they had letters that were signed from imams of different mosques around the country that we already had known derogatory information on. In other words, we were connecting the dots, and they were already on the law enforcement radar. So if you come into the country with an invitation letter, let's say it was the Mafia, John Gotti or something, law enforcement would be very interested in following you or understanding why are you coming to America. That's essentially what we did. We started interviewing the people, and in many cases we refused entry. In other words, we didn't let them come into the country. And I started that case back in 2006, 2007 era. Eventually, it got me sent to Washington, to the National Targeting Center, where I worked on this very same case in the Advanced Targeting Team, which, as you mentioned earlier, that's the unprecedented thing that you referred to earlier, is most people on temporary duty assignment are not assigned to the Advanced Targeting Team. It's a very advanced team. But I was, and I worked on the Tablighi case the whole time I was at NTC, and we had 1,200 different law enforcement actions based on that case. When I say 1,200, I mean what we call refusals of entries, cancellations of visas, or denial of the visa waiver program. So it was a good, strong program, good, strong case. It was authorized by the Chief Counsel of DHS, Department of Homeland Security, in August of 2011. So we had initially the full authority of the government behind us in the case that we were working on. But in March of 2012, members of the State Department came to the National Targeting Center. We sat down in a big room, and they said, we have concerns about your focus on Tablighi Jamaat because they have not been designated as a terrorist organization. Well, we shared some more information with them at that meeting, and the impression we got is that they were going to take that information and consider more seriously perhaps designating the Tablighi Jamaat as a terrorist group, but exactly the opposite happened. And before it was all said and done, they shut the entire case down. Then when I went back to Atlanta, I worked on another case, component of the same case, and that is the 67 records that they deleted out of the system that are related to the San Bernardino shootings. So that's how I start with San Bernardino and end the book with San Bernardino. Unfortunately, it had to do with the shootings that occurred there. It was tied to the case the government shut down.
So the question then that I have is, what was the excuse that they gave you for shutting it down?
They had concerns about the civil rights and civil liberties of the individuals affiliated with this group. That was a specific reason. We discovered that through FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, through Judicial Watch, and we got the internal emails that were going back and forth explaining what the background motivation was for their concerns about our focus on Tablighi Jamaat. They were not designated as a terrorist organization, so they felt that we were violating their civil rights and civil liberties by developing a law enforcement case based on that affiliation. And then you may recall that after the San Bernardino shootings, there was a big revelation. It had to do with Tashbeen Malik, the wife of Syed Farouk. You might recall that they said in public that they did not look into her social media, Facebook and so on, because they had concerns about violating her civil rights and civil liberties, except that she's a foreign national.
Okay, we're going to stop it here just for a second. I know Randall wants to weigh in because I can hear him heavy breathing across the room from me. If you have just joined me and Bareface, we will continue the interview, but we got to take a break here too. But Randall, clearly, this interview is coming back to you, right?
Yes, all is coming back to me, and yeah, as he brought up there, I'm glad that he said that, because that's what I was going to say. This civil rights and civil liberties of a foreign national tied to a group of a known terrorist group, not designated as a terrorist organization, but well known for the terrorist activities outside the U.S., invited by imams who are saying derogatory things about the United States of America. Many of them are shut out. Many of them are already here, and they're following these people. And the State Department comes and says, "Oh, don't you be keeping your eye on these people. You're going to violate their civil rights, their civil liberties. They're freaking foreign nationals, first of all."
Who cares? It was under the Obama administration.
I know.
Like, that matters, right?
They're not U.S. citizens. And just that alone doesn't make them, doesn't make the rights of citizens available to them, but they have these terrorist ties. And you don't think, no one's charging with the crime, they're just watching them. And for a good reason. I mean, if someone walks into walks into Walmart, with a trench coat and, keeps looking over their shoulder, they haven't committed any crime, but you better believe it that there are people in there, hopefully, keeping an eye on those folks. I used to work in a department store, okay? And one day I'm working in boys' clothing, and I was a floater. Anyway, I go to put some clothes on a rack, one of these circular racks that have, hanging clothes. And there's one of our security guys inside there. Remind me like a Get Smart kind of thing with, what was it, Agent 13, I remember. There was always like in a mailbox or a vending machine, something like that. Here's this guy in here, he's got his walkie, and he's, in the clothes. Anyway, long story short, it was because this couple were going through the store from department to department, just picking up stuff, and just the way they were going and, making their way toward, the outer store, to the doors. And, they couldn't do anything because they hadn't committed a crime, but just the way they were going about, their movements and stuff, they were being watched. That's right. Not a violation of their civil liberties, because they're people of suspicion, suspect. Right. Someone with terrorist ties enters the United States on the invitation of anti-Americans, foreign nationals come over. They can't be people of suspect, people you want to keep your eye on. Not according to the State Department, led by the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton.
At the time, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to read you part of this article, and then we're gonna remind you who our advertiser is. If you just joined us, I am Stacy Lynn Harp, and today what we're doing is we are playing an interview I did with somebody who allegedly murdered. He was a whistleblower during the Obama administration, and he wrote a book called See Something, Say Nothing. And in 2016, I interviewed him about that book and his co-author, Art Moore. And I'm going to read you part of this article coming from lawenforcementtoday.com. It says, we've received reports that Philip Haney, a DHS whistleblower on the Obama administration, has been found dead. We have not yet received independent confirmation from the Sheriff's Department, but sources within law enforcement have verified that there's a death investigation underway. If you've seen a few episodes of Behind the Uniform or have ever watched Fox News, you probably recognize the name Philip Haney. He was the DHS whistleblower that dropped the hammer on the Obama administration regarding the Muslim Brotherhood and ISIS. He was also a friend to many at Law Enforcement Today. And then it talks about some interviews that they did with him. It says here, multiple sources tell us that Philip's body was discovered outside San Francisco, California last night. The current indications point to him being shot to death. It's unclear when it happened or how. The details are still emerging. As soon as we have more information, we will provide an update. And then it says here, friends of Haney told us that they spoke with Haney earlier this week and he'd never been happier. They've suggested there's absolutely no way he would have taken his own life, and reinforced that he's had many enemies since he blew the whistle on the Obama administration. And it says here, close friends of Haney tell us that his wife lost her battle with cancer in 2019. Haney was engaged to be married later this year. The author of See Something, Say Nothing was preparing to go back on the road in advance of the upcoming election, and he was currently living in California just west of San Francisco. And then in 2018, Haney told Intercessors for America, prayer activists, that he had been working on a special assignment in Minnesota to stop Representative Keith Ellison from being elected Minnesota's Attorney General. As we approached the 2020 elections, friends of Haney's told us that he was planning on doubling down on efforts to protect America from progressive leftist socialo. And without their sponsorship, it's going to be, harder for us to meet ends. So, if you'd like to support our show financially, then feel free to go over to our show right now and donate over there at BibleNewsRadio.com/give and, help us do that. So this interview is about an hour long, it looks like. So I'm going to continue to play the interview. Randall, do you have anything else you want to say before I continue to play the interview that I did with him?
Other than I'm pretty confident he was murdered, and just
it went, yeah. It kind of looks that way.
I mean, just think about this article you're reading goes on that he wanted to protect America from leftist socialists and Islam and the efforts to establish Sharia law. He said their goal is to impose Sharia law here in the U.S.
And Keith Ellison has done that.
Yeah.
Keith Ellison, who is an Islam guy, swore himself in on the Quran when he became a legislator here in Minnesota.
Anyway, so
yeah. Okay.
And then what happens? Then there's
Let's hear the rest. We still got about 40 minutes left. Okay. So, yeah. Tommy says there was a motive if he was planning to become more involved in 2020 election. Right, which is why I'm interested in hearing what he had to say 4 years ago, because it's people like him, Robert Spencer, Nani Darwish, Waleed Shubat, and others, Kamal Salim, who have been on our show and talked about Islam and various things, plus 8 years of writing about Christian persecution, got me really familiar with Islam and how unpeaceful it is. Anyway, so let's go ahead and continue with the interview. Oh, I should turn the volume up.
Mandated civil rights and civil liberties. And so they didn't look into her social media. So they basically proved the whole premise of my story. That was exactly the same reason why they shut the Big Chase down. It was exactly the same reason why they deleted the records out of the system, and the 67 records in 2012. And it's exactly the reason why they didn't look further into her background before they gave her a visa.
Well, I can, I'm feeling angry as you're telling me this, just so you know. just a little bit, just because to me that's completely well, I mean, I could really rant right now, Phil, just so you know. I could totally rant. I could rant about lots of stuff. But when I hear it's like tied back to civil rights, when I look at other issues, like, we won't go into today because we're focusing on Islamic terrorism. It's just amazing to me that our government was willing to continue to put more people at risk because of civil rights, supposedly. That wasn't even legitimate, right? I mean,
well, they have a greater concern about enforcing the civil rights and civil liberties of foreign nationals than they do protecting American citizens from the threat of jihad attack.
Right. That's
what it comes down to. Mm-hmm.
So
otherwise, they wouldn't be deleting information out of the system. If they would err on the side of caution, they would leave that information in the system just in case there might be even 1% possibility that it might help us prevent an attack. But that's not the course that they chose.
Yeah, now I have a commenter, I think it's Randall, who's saying, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but that does sound fishy to them. And some people are saying no doubt. And I do want to remind everybody, if you just joined us, our two guests today, we have two great guests on the line. We have Philip Haney, who is a retired officer with the Department of Homeland Security. That's the short version. And we have Art Moore, who is the editor for WorldNet Daily, online news journalist. Art, do you want to add anything to what Philip just shared about that?
Yeah. Actually, I'd like to jump in and respond to the commenter who said it sounds kind of fishy. Let me say, and I could go on for a long time, but let me just in short say that Philip meticulously documented his nearly 14 years at DHS, and I've seen the firsthand documentation. He kept memos and letters and spreadsheets and all kinds of information that backs up what we're talking about. And furthermore, people that we either name in the book or because of security considerations, we used a pseudonym. These people have talked to Philip, since he's told his story. In many cases, they've actually read the book, and what they are telling him is that what he's writing is completely accurate. He did an excellent job of telling the story.
Randall, do you have a question?
Other than why? just over here shaking my head. Just the insanity that passes for policies. Just befuddled.
Well, I understand how people feel. I don't blame anyone. I call it the rubber band theory. Our minds is like a rubber band, and it takes a lot of effort to stretch your mind out like a rubber band to the point where and apprehend or comprehend what we're talking about here. But there's plenty of corroborating evidence. Don't just take my word for it. You can look at what happened with Benghazi.
Sure.
The constant flow of disinformation surrounding Benghazi. My book touches on Benghazi because I was involved with the Muslim Brotherhood. And, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, the February 17th Brigade, was Muslim Brotherhood. Those are the ones that were hired originally to protect the consulate. It was members of the Muslim Brotherhood, an armed branch of them. And then the whole driver of in Benghazi, the central figure, was also Muslim Brotherhood. And the fact that they were shipping weapons from Benghazi to Syria and arming opposition groups on the ground against Assad, which is still going on today, was also arming Muslim Brotherhood on the ground in Syria. So my involvement was that I was trying to alert the government, counterterrorism, Department of Homeland Security that the Muslim Brotherhood are not our friends. And yet I saw Benghazi happen right in front of me. So my involvement in this story is very direct and very personal. And the information that I provided to the counterterrorism and DHS was in the system well before the Holy Land Foundation trial. That was a large counterterrorism trial that took place in November of 2008 in Dallas, Texas, where they got, I believe it was 102 convictions of 5 different individuals for somewhere between $12 and $60 million of support, direct support of Hamas. That was called the Holy Land Foundation trial. During the course of that trial, it came to light that there were quite a few other affiliated front groups with the Holy Land Foundation trial that were providing additional support and networking for this whole system that was operating in the United States. Those individuals were originally supposed to be shut down, those organizations. They were never shut down. The leaders of those organizations were instead brought into the administration to help formulate both domestic and foreign policy. Thus, we come back to Benghazi.
Wow.
So in essence,
Yeah.
the U.S. government
Yeah.
hired foxes to guard the hen house in Benghazi.
I mean, it's
My
well,
my entire premise stands on the fact that after November of 2008, after the irrefutably proven links to these American-based groups to support of Hamas, they should have been shut down via law enforcement and federal court procedures, but they weren't.
yeah.
So that means that everything that happened after November of 2008 was deliberate and intentional. They can't say that they didn't know. This was the Department of Justice that did this case in Dallas. It wasn't out of ignorance. It was deliberate and intentional policy.
So our government is intentionally promoting Islam, basically, is what you're saying, because they're not protecting us from the terrorists who are Islamic or Muslim, whatever you want to call it. And, you know, when we watch the idiotic media, which is all programming anyway, it's all stupid, we all know that, but when we watch the media and there is a terrorist attack like in San Bernardino and other places in our country, and then Obama, who is a Muslim, in my opinion, gets up and says, oh, this isn't terrorism, this is just a fringe thing. And now you're telling us that they completely know it is. And, you know, a lot of us who are like going back to when Obama became the president, which how in the heck that happened, I have no idea, because nobody knows who this goon is, right? I mean, he's just like, where's his birth certificate? I've talked to Jerome Corsi quite a few times, and we still haven't quite figured that out. But aside from that, it just, and then the other layer is the whole issue of Christians being massacred all over the world by the Muslim Brotherhood and ISIS and all that too, and that's coming to America. I'm pretty sure of it. It just it doesn't paint a real happy picture of America or our government. You know what I mean?
Well, I do know what you mean, because I took a vow to protect our country from threat, both foreign and domestic, and I paid a great price. Again, addressing people that think this is so preposterous that it can't be possible, that it didn't happen, that I'm exaggerating. I never exaggerate. I wouldn't have survived being investigated by the federal government, including Department of Justice, criminal, Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security, all three going on at the same time. I wouldn't have survived it if I was prone to exaggeration or making false statements. There's no way I could have survived it. What kept me was the fact that I was speaking the truth. Because when it was all said and done, even they couldn't deny it. The information was in their own system before they took some of it out, but it was there. It was just a matter of looking at it. So, yes, I understand it. Go ahead.
Did you ever find it insulting, though, that they would look at you and go, what are you talking about? Because you did put all this together, and they're like, and they initially were like, well, who do you think you are, basically? Right?
What I found was insulting is, in particular, some of the statements from the administration when they would say things like, we didn't get a ping. That's what Napolitano said. Secretary of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, said vis-a-vis the Boston bombing, Sarnaev, we didn't get a ping. Well, the reason we didn't get a ping is because we weren't putting information in the system to ping off of. So it made us look like we were incompetent. But we weren't incompetent. We were following directives and procedures that we were ordered from headquarters to do. And then when President Obama, vis-a-vis the underwater bombers, said that we didn't connect the dots, well, how can we connect the dots when the government's policy is taking those pieces of information out of the system? So yeah, I was insulted, if you want to use that word, because we are very capable of doing our job, just like the Vietnam War veteran. Very capable of doing our job. It's not lack of training or motivation or equipment, any of those other technical or material things. It's simply the fact that we've been handcuffed and inhibited from doing our job.
Wow. Okay. Well, everybody, hey, if you just joined us, I want to let you know our guests today are Philip Haney and Art Moore. And the book we're talking about that's just been released today is called See Something, Say Nothing. A Homeland Security Officer Exposes the Government's Submission to Jihad. You guys can go to WND.com and get the book there. They have it there in the WorldNet Daily bookstore. That's where we prefer you go get it. And I'm going to hold this up for you. And Randall is going to take a minute here to mention our sponsors. So we'll do that for a couple minutes here.
Certainly. This broadcast is brought to you in part.
When this show started out, it was completely different than how we've done.
I've only been on board for 9 years.
Yeah, Bareface has made it all the better. But I think the thing that I find interesting is in the last year, 2 people that have been a guest on this show who are now dead. Jared Wilson, who killed himself. He was a pastor. And now Philip Haney, and I'm sure there's other guests I've had throughout the time that have died, but you know, I think this show is unique in the sense that, you know, we generally deal with the heavy topics but do it with a light touch, right? We're trying to encourage you in your faith, your Christian faith, and if you're not a Christian, then we're trying to discourage you away from that so that you become a Christian, right? I mean, because that's super important. But I kind of sit back and I think, you know, I've had a lot of high-profile people on this show, and it's funny to me because who am I? Just a fluffy-haired woman in the South. Anybody who knows anything politically or in the church, you know, but it looks like we got about 20 minutes left. So I'm going to go ahead and play the rest of this interview here.
Important to understand is that what we're talking about here is really a clash of worldviews, that there's a narrative that our government has put forward really since 9/11. It began under President Bush. And when I say this, you'll immediately recognize that so often when President Bush would refer to Islam, he talked about it as a religion of peace.
Right.
And he intentionally bought into a narrative of certain Northeast University scholars that essentially tried to equate Islam with every other religion, not recognizing that it has a very distinct political element to it that is what we're confronting right now, what we're faced with. And so what it means is that as Philip used the term handcuffed, I think that's a great way to describe what has happened to the thousands of really well-qualified, hard-working frontline officers, people behind the scenes in DHS, who are trying to simply do their job according to law enforcement principles. That is, you find the evidence and you follow it to where it leads. And the problem is that as we all know, just regular average people who are not directly involved in law enforcement, who are watching the news daily, it just seems obvious to us that there's a particular problem that arises out of Islam, the Islamic community worldwide, that's very different from Christianity or even Buddhism or Hinduism, and that there are interpretations of Islam, and we can have a debate about whether this is mainstream or not. That's, I think, a valid debate, but really you only need to understand that we don't have any concern about Baptist or Presbyterian suicide bombers. I mean, it's absurd to even say that. It's clear that it comes from a certain community. And so that's the reason why, in simple terms, when Philip was following the evidence where it led, and it led to people who were Muslims, that it was quashed because of this narrative that says that, no, we can't, that's discrimination. We can't treat Islam differently than we treat other religions.
Yeah, and that it's interesting because the culture that we lived in is so politically, quote, incorrect. I mean, it's politically correct, supposedly. But, I mean, Philip, when you were talking earlier about the different countries that you visited and you worked in, including Eritrea, one of the first thoughts that I actually had when you said that was that Christians are being persecuted in Eritrea. I mean, I had the blessing of writing persecution, and Eritrea came up on my email because of that. And the majority of the persecution against Christians over there is from Islam. Yeah, and or if you look at worldwide Christian persecution, it's not only Islam but it's communism. So it's people of faith, and this is part of the reason why I do this, because people of faith, Christians in America in particular, are so they're not being educated in the churches per se, because I don't think a lot of pastors are educated about the threat to their own faith here. But underneath all of this is that worldview. I mean, it's the Islamic worldview. Their belief is that this is how they're going to get into paradise, right? If they act out this stuff, that's why they're attacking the way that they are. Is that right?
Yes, they have a mandate to promote Islam and establish Sharia law on a global basis. There are no exemption areas. North America is not exempt from that mandate, nor is the church,
right,
nor are any other ethnic groups that exist on the face of the earth. Anyone who does not either submit, which is what the word Islam means, is immediately subject to coercion up to violence. You have to either submit to Islam, become a Muslim, or pay what is called the jizya, the protection tax for lack of a better term. Or the third option, which we've seen a lot lately, is to be killed.
Right.
And that's counterintuitive to the mentality of us in the West. We don't think like that. So it's another one of those concepts that's very difficult to take at face value.
So, how do we change that then? Because here you are. Would you call yourself like a whistleblower? I mean, for lack of a better term, by writing this book?
Well, I have been called a whistleblower by members of Congress. Okay. So, it's a fair term. Yes.
Okay. All right. So I don't mean it in a negative way at all, but if people aren't, if they're not aware of what's going on, you're telling the truth. Was there other believers or people in the DA who saw the same stuff that you saw, and or were they kind of scared into being quiet about it? Because something, say nothing. It's kind of like, I could take this on numerous layers, but you know what I'm saying. It's like, okay, yeah, I saw it. Nope, I'm not saying anything. Kind of conditioned by our government around all turns to turn people in, right, who have our worldview.
Well, there are a lot of people that are active duty within federal law enforcement community that would talk to you if they felt that they'd survive the career if they did. It's unusual for someone to go through all the way through federal service and then retire and have a story like this to tell. But there are a lot of people who, I had the advantage of being a little bit older. I was able to retire because I turned 62, not because of the length of time that I had in federal service. I retired with 15 years. I started a little late, but I was, by God's grace, able to retire at the age of 62. Otherwise, I would still be active duty, and I wouldn't be able to talk to you about this. Mm-hmm. But if you were to talk to people in ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, if you were to talk to people in Border Patrol, my own agency, Customs and Border Protection, and the military for that matter, they would all essentially tell you exactly the same thing. That the policies and directives of this current administration in particular have made it more difficult, if not impossible, for them to do their job.
Sure. I mean, so, all right, so let's go ahead and step into, let's say, controversial area. No, I don't know. Not like this isn't controversial, right? But, Art, what do you think of the current election process between Donald Trump and Hillary and how this will impact the future? And Phil, you can answer that too if you want. Because, a lot of people are like, well, Donald Trump, he's going to protect our borders, blah, blah, blah. And then, of course, Hillary, what does it matter anyway? Clinton, we have, her vying for the office of the presidency. What do you think is going to happen there?
Well, I think if Hillary Clinton wins, then we're going to see more of the same for certain. If Trump wins, there's not any guarantee, but there's more of a likelihood that I think we'll see an understanding of the fact that the enemy that we face is an enemy that's motivated by religion, and that will guide our policy. I think already, of course, a big issue has been what do we do with these immigrants, these refugees from Syria? Should we just let them in, or should we put a halt to immigration until we can figure out how to vet them? Because we know, and ISIS has declared this, is that among them are people who mean to come in here and form cells to carry out attacks. And so I think Donald Trump is raising the issue. He may at times backtrack and misstate a few things, but he's bringing up the issue, which I think is really important.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of bold too. So what do you think, Phil?
For me, it's pretty straightforward. I base my evaluation of the candidates on whether or not they will stand up and defend the Constitution. And from my perspective, the answer to that question is pretty clear. Based on past performance and behavior, I think it's pretty easy to determine which of the two candidates is more likely to stand up and defend the values of the Constitution, including those inalienable rights that were endowed to us by our Creator. For me, that's what it comes down to. I'm listening, or should I say, I'm watching the election from that perspective more on what they say. But I do agree that, let me restate that, if we had a wall around the United States that was 90 feet tall, that wouldn't protect us.
No.
Unless we have keepers at the gate, doorkeepers, so to speak, who are allowed to actually do the legally mandated law enforcement-based steps to vet and examine the people that are coming in and out of our country. Because there is no constitutional right. There's no amendment to the Constitution that gives anyone the right to come into our country without being questioned, examined, and evaluated. That's what visas are for. That's what passports are for.
Yeah, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, no one goes out their door to go shopping and leaves their front door wide open. That would seem foolish. It's obvious, but why do we do it on a macro scale?
Yeah, well, you know, what I've always wondered is how come we can't just be more like Israel? I mean, hello. You know, Randall and I, we went to Israel a couple, 7 years ago or something like that, and you know, getting on a plane, all that, you know, they asked us questions. I mean, just the security even to get on a plane to go to Israel was high, you know. I would think that we would be able to learn something from them and what they do, but it and then the other issue too, what you say is also that we already have Islamic terrorists here in the country. So then the question is, hey, we could keep them out, but have to deal with the ones that are the sleeping cells, right? How do we do that?
Yeah, that's the undefined nature. But I would encourage the listening audience to go study the case that was just concluded with the New York Police Department. The ACLU sued the New York Police Department along with CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, to prohibit the New York Police Department from developing fact-based analysis, doing trend analysis so that they could tell where the threat might be coming from. They put together a study of 15 different attacks, maybe it was 12 attacks, and laid all the common points out on the table and used that to develop a trend analysis. Well, the American Islamic community, along with the ACLU, sued the New York Police Department and prevailed after about 5 years. And it is now prohibited, specifically, the New York Police Department from using that analysis report in developing cases. Those are the kind of things we're going to have to move away from if we have any hope of improving the level of our national security.
Yeah. Art, do you have anything else to add to that? Hello, Art, are you there?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I would concur with that. I think that we really do need to examine fundamentally the way we do things. It's, you know, in many cases, politicians talk about we need to reform this, reform that, and they're not really talking about fundamental changes. And the thing about this whole issue is it really comes down to a fundamental divide that you, Stacy, know very well. You talk about it all the time. This clash of worldviews in our culture that manifests itself in many different ways. But that's really, you know, what it's ultimately going to come down to is a recognition of the fact that we've been blinded. We have a huge blind spot because of a faulty view of the world.
Yeah. Well, but you know, I think there is some hope, right? I mean, do you guys think that there is hope? I mean, Philip, I have to tell you, I'm glad that some of the things worked out for you. Okay, I'm glad that you were able to write the book. I mean, that's hopeful, right? That there's a little bit of help, and now you're getting the word out. You know, and despite the trial that you went through, which is horrible, I wouldn't want to go through it myself. Just saying, you know. But there is hope, right?
Absolutely. Every time I have opportunity to speak, I always convey a message of hope. We're fully capable of addressing this challenge that we face. There's a lot of people who are already in service, both in the military and in law enforcement, who are more than capable of addressing it. We don't have to violate anyone's civil rights, not as defined by the Constitution, in order to do it. No, I'm absolutely hopeful. I think you'd be surprised how fast we could turn it around if we were actually allowed to do it. The provisions and policies are already in place. It doesn't have to be draconian, but we do have to decide where our priorities are. Who are we actually trying to protect? And we have to come to terms with that. Once we do that, the rest of it will fall in line.
See, I agree with you. And I just have another question. It's not really on. Well, do you guys know who Hagman and Hagman are?
Doug Hagman?
Yeah.
Sure, yes.
You know who Doug is? Okay. They're here on Blog Talk Radio. They got a really big following. And you guys should definitely get on their show. I'm telling you. So I'm just saying, this is right up their alley. This topic and everything. And I could just see this exploding on their network, on their show. So if you need their info, let me know, and I'll send it to you.
I appreciate that. This is not an easy subject to discuss.
No,
it's counterintuitive to a lot of the way we're brought up as Americans. We're taught to believe that our elected officials really do have our welfare in mind.
And I ran across this
I had great
Lysol
respect
right
for the
here,
people
and it
that I
kills
talk about in the book.
that causes
And
germs
it hurt me badly
and many other
to
diseases
see them
and things that
essentially
surfacing
discredit
that's
themselves in public by making statements that were so obviously uninformed or disinformed or misinformed. I don't enjoy that at all. I have great hope for our country, and I would love to see us have the wherewithal to recover ourselves and do better going forward. That's what I say every chance I get.
Well, you know what? I want you to know, Philip, that you are like a hero to me, and I want to thank you for all the service that you did, and for the fact that you even, do this. I'm only 47, okay, and so I know you're a little bit older than me, but my generation is a little bit behind you, and what you did offers me hope for the next 20 years or 30 years of my life. So I just want you to know that just from my heart. And I'm really honored that you came to be on Beck Radio. And I hope a whole bunch of people go get your book, See Something, Say Nothing, A Homeland Security Officer Exposes the Government's Submission to Jihad. I mean, really, you're a real man, just so you know.
Well,
just had to
I
share
wanted
that.
to add a point. That's the importance of books. Even though we live in an electronic age, you notice that things can tend to disappear from the internet.
Yes.
You wake up today and it's gone. Well, that's one good thing about the book, is it documents in very careful detail a very important part of our America's history, from 9/11 till right up to current time. So I would encourage people to get it. If they doubt anything that I have to say, simply do a little work on their own part, and they will come to the same conclusion. I can guarantee you that. In fact, if anything, I understate. I don't exaggerate. I allow people to come to their own conclusions if they just put a little bit of effort into it. And again, I want to give a shout out to all my colleagues in law enforcement and in the military. We all know that we can do it. Just let us do our job, and we'll stand up for America. We will.
Amen. Was there a question there in the chat room?
I'm not sure if it's so much a question or a commentary.
Or if Randall is making a comment. Okay, and Art. Okay, so here's Art. Art also is a veteran journalist who covers hard topics, and obviously, Art, you're a hero of mine too, because you have been doing this forever, and you're also a real man, just so you know.
Well, thank you. I have to say, I want to tell everybody, it's been a tremendous privilege to work with Philip, and he is the real deal. I've been with him in many different settings, and we've been talking for some time now, just about every day, and he's legit. And I think if people doubt that, again, they can do their own research. But I think the more you hear Philip talk about his story, the more you realize that he is just laying out the facts as they are. And I would encourage people who are frustrated with what they see to get a copy of the book and to contact your congressman, because it's really going to be we the people that make the changes. And what we found is tremendous enthusiasm when people hear about Philip's story, then when they read the story, even more enthusiasm. And what they're saying is that, yeah, I've wondered about this, I've had similar thoughts, and now this confirms what I thought. And so the next thing to do to relieve that frustration is to take action and to contact people in our government. Philip has a lot of good relationships with people in Congress, but what we really want to see is a groundswell. We want to see Congress members from every part of the country raising the same questions.
Amen. So do you guys have besides the WorldNet Daily website to get the book, do you guys have any other websites people might be able to go to?
I don't.
Okay.
Yeah,
Not yet.
Yeah, certainly the WND books has a site for the book, and if you type in "see something, say nothing," WND, you can find that page, and if you go to Amazon, you can also see a page on the book there, and then it's also beginning today. It should be in Barnes and Noble stores. So for people, I know there are still some people that would prefer to go to a bookstore, and you can go there and find the book.
Right. Well, you guys, this has been a privilege for me to have you both here, and I'm hoping and praying that this word gets spread far and wide, and of course I'll be praying for both of you because I know how the enemy of our souls, not only just the enemy of people in general, but the devil, he will spread you and try to get you out. I'll stand for you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Yes.
You're welcome.
Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
All right, so it's weird hearing myself interview somebody.
And welcome back to Hannity. Donald Trump, he's going to join us in just a few minutes. But first, earlier today, an unhinged President Obama, he lashed out at Donald Trump and those who dare to question why he refuses to use the simple term radical Islam. Watch this.
For a while now, the main contribution of some of my friends on the other side of the aisle have made in the fight against ISIL is to criticize this administration and me for not using the phrase radical Islam. This is a political distraction, and that kind of yapping has not prevented folks across government from doing their jobs. Disrupting plots and protecting all Americans, including politicians who tweet and appear on cable news shows. We now have proposals from the presumptive Republican nominee for President of the United States to bar all Muslims from emigrating to America. And if we fall into the trap of painting all Muslims with a broad brush and imply that we are at war with an entire religion, then we are doing the terrorist work for them.
Here with reaction, author of See Something, Say Nothing, a Homeland Security officer, exposes the government's submission to jihad. Former DHS employee Philip Haney. Philip, now you started working for DHS in what, 2003, correct?
Yes, I was a founding member of DHS.
And part of your job is you were looking for terror ties. For example, you would identify people with terror links. In the early 2000s, you were profiling people with links to all of these terror groups. That was your job, right?
Yes, we were connecting the dots. We were focusing on individuals and organizations, networks across both the United States and with affiliations in foreign countries.
Then 6 years into your tenure in 2009, you were ordered to scrub the records of Muslims with these terror ties by our government. Who told you to do that?
I was directed from DHS headquarters. It's important to keep in mind that that was 1 year after the November 2008 Holy Land Foundation trial, the largest terror trial in American history, that irrefutably proved that these individuals from the Muslim Brotherhood front groups were in direct financial support of Hamas.
And that's, that's the trial where CARE was named as an unindicted co-conspirator, if I'm not mistaken.
as along with Islamic Society of North America and the North American Islamic Trust, three major groups.
Okay, so you were doing your job, identifying individuals, you built up a computer database, Obama becomes president, you are literally ordered to scrub the names of Muslims with terror ties that you had worked so hard to find. You believe you could have stopped what happened in Orlando and San Bernardino had you not been ordered by Obama's DHS to do this. Is that true?
Well, that was the first, what I call the first great purge. That was in 2009 with more than 800 records. The case that I'm referring to about stopping the San Bernardino and now related to the Orlando was 3 years later in 2012. It was a larger case called the Tablighi Jamaat Initiative, and it was another network separate from, but related to in some ways, the Muslim Brotherhood network that we just talked about.
So, in the case of San Bernardino, it was Saeed Farouk and his wife. You had identified that mosque as a place where you believe we should have been paying attention to, correct?
There's an entire network of those kind of mosques across the United States, and I found out a couple of days ago that the mosque in Fort Pierce is also related to the same network. Two big cases now.
Let me ask you bluntly, could San Bernardino, but you were doing this great work, and I applaud you for what you have done. You were told to scrub, literally, the records of Muslims with terror ties. You had to do your job or you'd be fired. Do you believe in your heart that the information you had gathered, if you had kept that information, you might have been able to prevent the terrorist attacks in both San Bernardino and Orlando?
Well, to clarify, I wasn't told to scrub. My agency deleted them themselves. But yes, I believe I have a plausible premise that we could have stopped it by two major ways. Either Syed Farouk would have been put on the no-fly list and not allowed to travel, or his pending fiancée would have been denied a visa because of his affiliation with an organization with plausible ties to terrorism. That's at least two different ways.
Can I repeat this one other way? You did your job, and other people did their jobs, and in comes the Obama administration, and they wipe out all the work that could have potentially saved the lives of Americans. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, it's a fair statement. My records were tagged, and I got an email from all 67 of them when they were deleted, and they came back to my inbox exactly the moment when they were entirely deleted from the system.
Oh, my God. This is unconscionable. Phil Haney, thank you for telling the truth and speaking out. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
It shocks the conscience.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify here today. Also, I'd like to express my appreciation for the patience of the members on the committee and Senator Coons while obtaining a copy of my written testimony. I'd like to start with a visual aid. This is the Homeland Security Advisory Council Countering Violent Extremism Subcommittee Interim Report for 2016. My colleague referred to it earlier as suggesting that we should refrain from using words like Ummah or Jihad or Sharia. I would like to also show you another visual aid, and this is what is called the Words Matter memo that was published in January of 2008. And my story today is going to be what happened between these two documents, these two touchstone documents, 2008 and 2016, because it was during that period of time that what we know now as the Countering Violent Extremism policy came to be. And one of the expressions of that policy is what we heard about in the media in a few days after the Orlando shootings, that Attorney General Lynch was going to release partial transcript of Orlando 911 calls with all references to Islamic terrorism removed. That is a condensation of what was actually happening behind the scenes with subject matter experts like myself who were sworn officers to protect our country from threat, both foreign and domestic. Between these two dates, 2008 and 2016, came what I call the first great purge. When I was ordered by the Department of Homeland Security headquarters to modify, a euphemism, removing all linking information out of approximately 820 text subject records in our law enforcement system that almost exclusively had to do with Muslim Brotherhood Network here in the United States. I was told to remove all unauthorized references to terrorism, that I was no longer allowed to do what are called memorandums of information received, what we call MOIRs, no more text records, no more research, and no more special treatment from the agency. But during that time, hundreds of law enforcement actions had been taken in the 3-year period when those 820 plus records were still in the law enforcement system. At exactly the same time, a controversial inaugural meeting took place on January 27th and 28th, 2010, between American Muslim leaders and the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano, which was hosted by the Department of Homeland Security Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. It was controversial because several of the individuals attended the invitation-only conference in D.C. were known affiliates of at least 2 of the same Muslim Brotherhood front groups that had just been named as unindicted co-conspirators in the largest terrorism trial in the history of the United States, the Holy Land Foundation trial. Also that spring, at least 6 individuals with known affiliations to the Muslim Brotherhood front groups were appointed to the Countering Violent Extremism CVE Working Group, which was convened under the authority of the Homeland Security Advisory Council. I would like to show you now the logo of the Muslim Brotherhood, the moderate organization that this administration chose to ally itself with. Across the middle it says Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, which means the brothers of the Muslim, or the Muslim Brotherhood. And at the bottom, taken from Quran 860, is the word Wa'ayuda, which means prepare yourselves to terrify your adversaries with steeds of war or weapons of war. That is the motto of the Muslim Brotherhood. By the spring of 2010, we had come to the point that a CBP officer was literally linking information, meaning the dots, on Muslim Brotherhood-linked individuals from text, while the administration was bringing the very same individuals into positions of influence to help create and implement our counterterrorism policy, both in the domestic arena and in the foreign policy arena, as evidenced in our overt support of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Libya, Algeria, and Syria. Fast forward to August 30, 2011, when the Tablighi Jamaat court case that I worked on was approved by the Chief Counsel of Department of Homeland Security. And this is an icon of the Tablighi Jamaat movement, one of the largest in the world. Outside of the United States, it's called the Army of Darkness. I began a TDY assignment, meaning temporary duty, at the National Targeting Center in November of 2011. Within 6 months, we had instituted 1,200 law enforcement actions on the case that we had started. But in September of 2012, what I call the second Great Purge, when the administration removed 67 linking records out of that case that had direct ties both to the San Bernardino Mosque, Darul Uloom al-Islamiyya San Bernardino, and the Islamic Center of Fort Pierce down in Florida. In other words, the network that we had worked on at NTC is tied directly to the terrorist attacks that we've seen recently. At the end of my career, I was relieved of my service weapon. All access to text was cut off and suspended. My secret clearance was revoked, and I was sequestered for 11 months while the results of 3 simultaneous investigations from 3 different branches of the government were concluded. In July of 31 of last year, I retired honorably. In conclusion, the threat of Islamic terrorism does not just come from a network of armed organizations such as Hamas and ISIS, who are operating over there somewhere in the Middle East. In fact, branches of the same global network have been established here in America, and they are operating in plain sight, especially among those of us who have been charged with the duty of protecting our country from threats both foreign and domestic. The goal, meaning the strategy of the global Islamic movement, is based on Quran 2, 191 through 193, and is actually quite simple: to establish Sharia law everywhere in the world, including here in America. And there is an organization in the United States that's actively doing that. It's called the Assembly of Muslim Jurists of America. Very benign sounding name, but in Arabic is Majama Fuqaha al-Sharia bi Amrikiya. the group of lawyers implementing Sharia law in the United States, which is unconstitutional. The threat that we face today that continues growing despite the willful blindness of those who insist on pretending otherwise are not the tactical methods of violent extremism, terrorism, or even operative verbs such as jihad, but rather the historical and universally recognized Islamic strategic goal of implementing Sharia law everywhere in the world so that no other form of government, including the United States Constitution, is able to oppose its influence over the lives of those who must either submit to its authority, become second-class dhimmi citizens, or perish. Thank you very much for your attention. That evening, though, you know, I left my media DNA all over the country because I told people repeatedly that Donald Trump was going to win the presidency. How did I know that? You know, I went through a lot. I'm a steward and a guardian of the story that is discussed in See Something, Say Nothing. But it came at a great price. So I have to maintain my own personal integrity in order to maintain the integrity of the story, which, by the way, is still in process. None of the issues or the cases that I discuss in the book have been resolved to this very day. But it's my intention to remedy that. And those of you, all of you, believe in prayer, do pray for us, me and my wife, because we intend to see this through to the end. It has to be resolved. But the anthem that we sang tonight starts out with a question. "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming?" It's a question. The people of Baltimore were up on the tops of the houses watching the battle between the British fleet and the soldiers at Fort McHenry. I didn't know that on the flanks of the fort were a battery of 20,000-pound cannons, and that in front of it, defending the fort, was a battery of 50,000-pound cannons that are so big that you could literally stick your head in them, which I did just to see if I could do it. So it was a stalemate. Neither side actually won or lost. But the people on the roofs of the houses were watching in a driving rain to see the outcome. And they were wondering, I believe, the same thing that Americans were wondering on the eve of the election, which in Central Time at 02:40 in the morning, almost in an anticlimactic way, Pennsylvania has gone to Trump. And a lot of the people that went to sleep and didn't see that announcement were wondering in the morning whether they would see the flag. Isn't that true? Or at least which flag it might be that was waving. And I believe it was high fives, fist bumps, and hallelujahs when we discovered that she was still waving. I've also discovered, going through the trauma of nearly 12 years of nonstop investigations by my own colleagues and my own government that I took a pledge to defend, that it's easy to be distracted, even at this point. We talk a lot about the nature of the threat we face, but we should also not forget to ask, what are we fighting for? It might even put it in a different perspective. So what are we fighting for? Yeah, we have a lot of threats that we can describe in detail, but what we are fighting for is the Constitution and the principles that this government was founded on. The Constitution is the protector of our country more thoroughly and more completely than any wall that could possibly be built. Yes, the wall along the border could help if it's built correctly and if it's managed and monitored correctly. But the true wall around our country is the Constitution. And I would like to call for a constitutional revival so that we really know the values that we live by, those freedoms and liberties that our Creator endowed us with. And by the way, to echo the rabbi vis-a-vis Israel, I'd like to also add a prayer. Sha'alu shalom Yerushalayim yishlayu ohavaich. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They shall prosper who love thee. And I believe that applies to now. Our country is like a sponge floating in the water. There's lots of other sponges, other countries floating in the water too. We can't be taken out of the water because it's the world that we live in. And what I call saturation, and that is the attempt of the progressive leftists and their nihilistic allies called the global Islamic movement, are seeking to alter or abolish the current form of government that we live under. Ironically, exactly what it says in the Declaration of Independence. And that sponge floating in the water will become saturated with water, won't it? To the point where it's basically completely submerged. And then there are forces who want to push from the top and accelerate that saturation process. So what, since we can't move the sponge out of the water, insulates us, makes us waterproof from being saturated by the things that would destroy us? What is that insulating power that keeps us from being saturated? The Constitution. That's what protects us, friends. So that's what I'm standing up for, and that's what I intend to continue fighting for, because I took a vow to protect our country from threat, both foreign and domestic. And even though I'm now currently retired from federal law enforcement, my vow is still active duty. And I follow my vow wherever it leads me. And tonight, my friends, has led me to stand in front of you. So I'm greatly honored to be the inaugural recipient, and I hope that I will be an example of those who come after me, that it will be a coveted prize simply for the sake of standing up and defending the liberties that our Creator endowed us with. Thank you very much.
Philip Haney is a counterterrorism expert. The former officer with the Department of Homeland Security is the author of See Something, Say Nothing. The Whistleblower tells us how the records of Muslims with terrorist ties were deleted by the Obama administration and how the government is submitting to jihad.
How many here support missionaries overseas in some way or another? Have you ever had a missionary come and speak to you? You have, just now. You have people from Iran who lived it, and you have a person from Egypt. Both of them are now citizens of our country. They're coming to tell us what they saw firsthand. Now you know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of a missionary. An American who goes to a foreign country is received in exactly the same way as Annie and Usama. Are you going to receive what they say? The question, I'm sure, in all of our minds will be, well, what are we supposed to do about it? Right? Is it? What is Sharia law? Actually, let me back up. What is the actual threat that we face? And let me back up even further from that. What are you all here, independently and individually and sometimes in groups, what are you fighting against? Can someone tell me what you're fighting against? Okay. Anybody else? Just call out. What are you fighting against? Good. All good things. Now please tell me, what are we fighting for?
Liberty.
Constitution.
You're on my team, on the Intel team, right over there. That is what we're actually fighting for. Why? Because if you say you're fighting for liberty, whose liberty are you fighting for? If you say you're fighting for freedom, then whose freedom are you actually fighting for? Illinois version? Wisconsin version? Minnesota version? Iowa? Maybe? But it's not specific enough, is it? What is our country based on? What is the foundation of our country? We hold these truths to be self-evident that God, the Creator, has endowed us with unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that the Creator instituted government among men, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, in order to preserve the liberties that He endowed us with. Which means by default, if we say we believe in the Creator, we are obligated by duty to be participants in the government that the Lord Himself instituted in order to protect the liberties that He gave us. I won't say the word stupid. However, what is it if you're too short-sighted and don't even have the wherewithal to recognize that you're a participant in the government that was created or instituted by the government, the Lord Himself, in order to simply protect you from chaos and violence? Do you know what the primary duty of the federal government is according to the Constitution? To protect the states from outbreaks of civil violence. Did you know that? And or to protect the country from foreign invasion. Those are the two, actually foreign evasion too, now that I think about it, like the Iran deal. That's a good example of foreign evasion. The Constitution is there to protect the country from foreign invasion, and the federal government's primary responsibility is to protect each state from civil unrest. Are they doing it? So what is the threat? Is it terrorism? No, that's a tactic. What is the threat? The threat is this strategy of the global Islamic movement, which, according to its own definition, Sharia law is superior to all man-made forms of law. I said all, underlined, italicized, and emphasized, including the U.S. Constitution. By its own definition, Sharia law will be forever superior to all forms of man-made law, including the Constitution. That is the gravitational force that drives the entire global Islamic movement, not jihad. Jihad is a tactic. And as long as we don't recognize the distinction between the strategy, which is the goal of the global Islamic movement, and the tactics that they will use to implement it, we will lose. Because we're putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Right? If you fight tactics, anybody here shoot? What are you supposed to do with the target? You acquire it and you aim in, right? And you move with the target. What will happen if you shoot all rounds downrange while the target is moving? You're wasting your ammo, aren't you? That's tactical. But what if you know that this moving target's intention or final position will be right over there by that door? This moving target, rather than shooting rounds downrange and missing, why not just go over to the door and wait for it to come? That's the difference between strategy and tactics. Our foreign policy has been based primarily on addressing tactics and not addressing the strategy. It is a fatal error. All the losses that we have suffered in the Middle East since the 9/11 are primarily because we don't understand the difference between strategy and tactics. And now we're about to go back over and do it again in Afghanistan. Whereas, did you know, for example, that there is an Al-Qaeda number 3 now? The shattered remnants of the original Al-Qaeda, which, by the way, wasn't just Osama bin Laden. It was 5 sheikhs and 12 organizations coalesced into an organization that we know of commonly as Al-Qaeda. ISIS, that we hear about so much, was another step above that. ISIS at the current time has a coalition of 35 different organizations, and I don't know exactly how many sheikhs, qadis, and mahdis and leaders there are in the organizational structure of the global network we hear so often called ISIS. Now they've formed a third coalition. And I'm going to give you a homework assignment. I want you to listen carefully on the news and see when the first time will be that you hear of this new organization, which is called AQIS, Al-Qaeda of the Indian subcontinent. Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. Have we been hearing about Myanmar lately? The Rohingyas, the poor persecuted Rohingyas. You know that there are jihadis seeking to subvert the government of Burma. AQIS, Al-Qaeda of the Indian subcontinent, has now coalesced into a macro global organization. And if you want to hear what their intentions are, I should say, read. They've been very kind to produce an English briefing on the strategy and tactics of the global Islamic movement that I have read in my entire professional career, which I've been doing since the middle of the 70s. When I used to work in the Middle East as an entomologist, everybody know what an entomologist is? It's a nerd. We patented, us entomologists patented the white lab coat, the clipboard, and the pen holder. We own the patents on that. But then my cruise control personality is 50% Clark Kent and 30% Steve Martin, because humor is still legal and we should use it while we can, right? But I have 20% Chuck Norris. If I couldn't have been an armed federal law enforcement officer and wear a gun for a living if I didn't have at least some streak of Chuck Norris, could I? No. AQIS published, it's called Dawa, means promotion of Islam. They are required according to Sharia law to tell us exactly what they intend to do. It's a requirement. They published it in well-written English, a 20-page briefing called the Code of Conduct. And at the top of the list of strategic goals is to kill Americans and Israelis wherever they find them, just like what the verse that he wrote. Terrorize them wherever you find them. That tells you it's deliberate and intentional. It's not arbitrary or accidental. When you look for somebody until you find them, that is direct, deliberate, and intentional action. Is that correct? It's not accidental. Please go online, look it up, and read it. And if you have any questions, you can email any of the three of us. We're capable of addressing the Quranic and Hadith-based strategy and tactics in the AQIS Code of Conduct. There is no remaining facade, no more pretense, no more warm-ups, no more preliminaries, no more dress rehearsals. Al-Qaeda has now merged into a global macro organization. It's going to suck in jihadi Islamists from all over the world. And what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? Now I'm going to connect my story. But before I do that, what is Sharia law, by the way? If you only know one thing about Sharia, the stuff about women is bad enough. But the one thing that if you don't know anything else about Sharia at all, you should realize that according to Sharia law, to leave Islam is a death sentence. There is no freedom of religion in Islam. If you are an apostate, you have a mark on the middle of your forehead, and they will kill you. The only places that you have the luxury of surviving not being a Salafi Muslim is in a liberal country like America, where you have the freedom of religion. But there's a dark shadow coming over our country, and it's called Sharia. That's the threat. The other side of the threat, of course, is the progressive movement that wants to shatter the constitutional republic that we're based on. And people ask me over and over, why are they doing it? And I can tell you it's in the Declaration of Independence, that when a government becomes tyrannical, it is the right and the duty of the populace to alter or abolish the current form of government and replace it with one that is more suitable to their worldview. Alter or abolish is also known as hope and change. They are seeking to alter or abolish the current form of government and replace it with one. The progressive leftists have their own definition, whereas the Islamic have their own definition too, and that's why they're natural allies. But I will tell you now, the green will always eat the red, because the reds don't know what they believe. They're willing to allow other people to die for what they say they believe, but they don't actually have a defined strategy and tactic, whereas Islam does. And that's why they will always devour the progressive left. They're much more dangerous because they know what they believe. So what is the threat? The implementation of Sharia law. So the bottom line is there are three arenas: social, political, and law enforcement. Each one of you is going to be drawn to one of those three arenas. Social arena trigger point is immigration reform. Look at how much trouble we're having reforming our immigration policy. That is in the social arena. Diversity and inclusion. We're going to make this country more diverse and inclusive whether you like it or not. It's a social experiment. The second one is the political arena, and the flashpoint for that is going to be whether or not we have the sovereign right to establish an embassy in Jerusalem. Of all things, you say, how in the world would that be the indicator? Because the whole world is telling us that we do not have the sovereign right to establish an embassy in the city of Jerusalem with our best ally in the Middle East, and if we do it, they will declare war on us and attack us. And the third arena is law enforcement. And the flashpoint for that one is going to be the designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. Whether we do it or whether we don't do it will be an indicator whether we have the wherewithal to recover our country or not. Promise you, write them down and keep them in mind. Think about what I said tonight. I was a founding member of the Department of Homeland Security. I was there from the very first literal day. I saw like new corn in the spring. Everybody here knows about new corn in the spring, don't you? And I saw it spring up from the ground, and I saw it mature into what it is today. I was there. I saw all of it. And I got into an inordinate amount of trouble because I picked the two particular organizations that are posing the greatest threat to the national security of our country: the Muslim Brotherhood and a group called Tablighi Jamaat, which means the party of the promoters that comes out of the Indian subcontinent, the very place that I just told you about, AQIS. So even though the U.S. government shut the case down, I was right. And that's why I'm standing here today. I just got back from Israel, and I found out that the people in that part of the region see Americans as ignoring and overlooking the nature of the threat, the gravitational force that is emanating out of the Indian subcontinent, which now has coalesced into a macro Al-Qaeda organization. And here I was back 10 years ago warning the U.S. government of the threat of this group. And my case was shut down, and I was investigated 9 times. My gun was taken from me. My secret clearance was revoked. All access to the systems were removed. I was sequestered for the last 11 months with no assigned duties while I was under investigation from the Department of Justice, who were seeking to find probable cause to indict me and put me in jail for the violation of the civil rights and civil liberties and/or the privacy rights of foreign nationals. The second investigation was Internal Affairs, Customs and Border Protection, and the third investigation was the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security, all three at the same time. That's how I ended my career. I was able to retire, thanks to the Lord about that. And now I'm here standing before you. I saw it. I saw it from inside the federal government in the same way that Osama and Annie saw it from their world where they came from. We're all telling you the same thing. Am I making my point? So I'm going to leave or finish up with an allegory. Imagine this whole room here is a big swimming pool. And there are 192 sponges floating around in the swimming pool. I think that's the number of the countries in the world. Let's just say 200 sponges. Each one is a country floating around in the water. What is the natural thing that's going to happen when sponges float around in water? Water saturates into them, right? These sponges are all a little different. And the other thing that you should know when I ask you the final question, which is the final question, what can we do? You cannot take the sponges out of the water. Because why? Because the water is the world that we live in. So the sponges are floating around, bumping into each other, and water is soaking into them in various rates, some faster and some slower. Some sponges are already supersaturated and are basically about to sink. If you don't happen to be satisfied with the rate of saturation from the water coming from underneath, what are you going to do to speed up the process? You're going to push on the sponge from above. That's terrorism. That's a tactic. The other form of saturation was the water coming from up. That's the Muslim Brotherhood. Saturation from underneath up. Whereas Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah, Hamas are pushing the sponge from the top. That's why they won't condemn each other.
During the time of
They all
Umar ibn
know that
Khattab
the
radiallahu
tactics
anhu,
are different, but the strategy is exactly the same. To saturate the sponge with Sharia. So here's the $64,000 question. I think with inflation it's probably like, $80,000 question now. How do you waterproof the sponge? Remembering that you can't take it out of the water. So how do you waterproof the sponge? More fundamental than that. You can actually waterproof the sponge without having a border wall. It is actually possible to protect the sovereignty with our country without a physical border. But it isn't possible unless everybody from baby to grandpa is involved in the process. Remember Kindergarten Cop? Stranger, stranger. If everybody is involved in the process, we don't actually need a physical wall as much as we need to go back to find the answer to the question that I asked you. What waterproofs the sponge? And now we're back where we started. What are you fighting for? The Constitution. It's the Constitution that waterproofs the sponge. At that point, it doesn't matter what tactic is used to try to saturate the sponge. If the sponge is waterproofed, the Constitution protects us and those endowed liberties that we received more powerfully than any kind of physical wall. And my second homework assignment, we will close, is that whatever arena that you happen to work in, whether it's the political arena, the social arena, or the law enforcement, that whatever position you take going now, including all the organizations that are representative, you need to be able to cite literally chapter and verse from the Constitution when you go into the arena and challenge the status quo. You have to be able to point back to the Constitution and say, according to Article 6, the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the judges of each state are bound thereby. Period. Which means Sharia law is illegal in the United States. Flat bottom line. What constitutes the waterproofing of the sponge is the U.S. Constitution. And of course it goes without saying that the U.S. Constitution, and here's an irony, is saturated with biblical principles. And that will also help waterproof the sponge. So if you're on the faith side of the equation, you don't have to worry about violating your principles of faith because the Constitution is saturated with biblical principles. If you're not on the faith side of the equation, you can still be a valiant defender of the Constitution and help protect our country from threat, both foreign and domestic. How many have taken the vow? Either in the law enforcement, military, or public office. Does any of you who have ever taken the vow here feel like your vow is retired, even though you might be? Nor do I. And that's why I'm standing here. I took the vow to help protect our country from threat, both foreign and domestic, and protect the Constitution. And right in the vow is the answer to the question. And if you've never taken the vow in law enforcement and or military and or political office, I don't want you to feel left out. Because you, in your heart, right now or tomorrow or the next day, can take the vow to help protect our country from threat, both foreign and domestic, and get into the fight, which it is. Our forefathers had to make the same choices, and they made them. And that's why we're here today. And our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren are going to ask, what did you do back in 2017 when we began to realize that there was an emerging threat? What did you, Papa? What did you, Grandpa and Grandma? And you need to be able to tell them, well, I did this, and I did that, and I did the other thing, and son or daughter or grandma or grandson or granddaughter, it was all based on the Constitution. And I want you, son or daughter or granddaughter, to carry on my tradition of the example that I set. We all need to be able to do that. And with that, even though I could go on for a month, because I have lots of things to tell you, I'm going to stop because I think it's time for questions.
What's it like to get a recognition like this here in Los Angeles, your hometown?
Well, in all honesty, it's very humbling. As many who've served their country will say, we're only doing what our vow was. And I took that very seriously. I'm very proud to have received the honor, and I'm going to continue to do my utmost to what's the word?
Will you get back into government?
Well, I would be willing to be re-deputized, for sure. And I've said so publicly quite a few times, essentially to Mr. Trump, that if you want to drain the swamp, I can help you because I know where some of the valves are. Yeah, so yeah, I would be willing to do it.
But is there still an element within that's essentially sabotaging or working against the White House interest?
Well, I call them gravitational forces that kind of trying to pull the ship off a course. And I have, in all honesty, had some disappointments lately, and some of him was walking back some of his promises, in particular from a law enforcement perspective. The reluctance to go ahead and designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, that's a real serious breach right there, because that's one of the reasons why I was elected. And we're going to see how the foreign policy unfolds. Right now, especially with tomorrow and the next day visiting Israel, we'll see what his offer is there. We saw Saudi Arabia today, and he was better than a couple of the past administrations in describing the problem, but I kind of characterize it as a day with intermittent clouds, some shadows, but some open spaces too. But
how concerned are you about the way that the media is abandoning their objectivity and over-reporting on the White House?
Well, right now I characterize it as a spasm of collective psychosis, because we don't seem to be capable of telling our left hand from our right hand, and the media is only part of the equation. It's people that are allowing them to continue to mis and disinform them. And virtually nothing that you see in the media today is really accurate. And with people that I'm affiliated with, we usually know days, if not weeks ahead of time, major events that are going to take place. That's the nature of Washington. And virtually in every case, much more to the story than what was being reported in the media. So I've seen this for a long time.
StarChart.com.
Do that. Do you hear me? Yeah, stop all departures. Yeah, went in the Pentagon.
ISIL's ability to carry out terrorist attacks in Syria, Iraq, and abroad has not to date been significantly diminished, and the tempo of ISIL-linked terrorist activity is a reminder of the group's continued global reach. Gentlemen, you have a very difficult task, trying to defend our homeland, trying to keep Americans safe. But in reading this, I just want to make the point that it's been 2 years since President Obama laid out our goal, America's goal toward ISIL, which was defeated. 2 years. It took us about 4 years to defeat Nazi Germany.
And the like. This makes for a more complicated and challenging homeland security, public safety environment. I think I speak for all three of us when I say that the prospect of the next terrorist-inspired attack on our homeland is the thing that keeps us up at night, most often.
Engine 108, we have a report of a plane crash somewhere in the area of the Pentagon. We're trying to...
An effective deterrence policy. Therefore, if a decision is prematurely made to separate NSA and Cyber Command, I will object to the confirmation of any individual nominated by the President to replace the Director of the National Security Agency if that person is not also nominated to be the Commander of Cyber Command. This committee and this chairman are tired of the way that Congress in general and this committee is treated by this administration.
No more. That is a very important way in which we're transformed, and it's a testament to the quality of people doing this work. I'm proud to be able to represent them. And so I appreciate your support of the FBI in our work, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Director Coleman.
So this is Senate hearing. We're expecting it to start shortly. The Senate in session today, the House out until July 5th. Earlier today, the Senate in a 52-48 vote blocking a Zika funding bill. That's a near party line vote, 60 votes needed to move forward. President Obama heading to Canada tomorrow. He'll be meeting with leaders of Canada and Mexico, and there may or may not be coverage of a state dinner in Ottawa. If there is, we'll bring it to you.
You have all of your homophobia.
Everyone take a seat.
I can give it to you after if you'd like.
Take a seat.
This is your stupid.
Good afternoon and welcome. On November 5th, 2009, at Fort Hood in Texas, an Army major named Nidal Hassan gunned down 14 innocent persons, including an unborn child, while shouting Allahu Akbar. Prior to this terror attack, and apparently folks in the gallery find it amusing, a terrorist murdering 14 innocent souls. Prior to this terror attack, federal officials were aware that Hassan had attempted to contact al-Qaeda and exchanged numerous emails with the terrorist Anwar al-Awlaki. a self-professing soldier of Allah, Hassan had also worried many colleagues with his promotion of an extreme or radical interpretation of Islam. Yet, for fear of being branded as politically incorrect or otherwise, they did nothing. Then, after the fact, the Obama administration classified these terrorist killings as mere workplace violence. In January of 2010, the Department of Defense issued a report entitled Protecting the Force, The Lessons from Fort Hood. The report did not mention Hassan by name, nor did it use the terms Islam or jihad. I would like nothing more than to speak with a government official about these bizarre decisions and omissions, and about the pattern that has characterized 7 years of the Obama administration, especially in light of the most recent terror attack in Orlando by a radicalized man who'd been interviewed 3 times by the FBI, and yet whose terror attack was not prevented. Indeed, this subcommittee invited 2 such witnesses: John Carlin, an Assistant Attorney General for the Department of Justice's National Security Division, and Michael Steinbach, the Executive Assistant Director for the FBI's National Security Branch. Both members of the Obama administration have refused to appear before this Senate hearing. 3 months after Fort Hood, in February 2010, the Quadrennial Homeland Security Review made 0 references to Islam, radical or otherwise. Again, this subcommittee would have appreciated speaking with government officials about this deliberate omission. Again, they have refused to appear or testify. In 2011, the group Muslim Advocates sent a letter to the Obama administration claiming the federal government had somehow become infected with, quote, false and highly offensive training materials about Muslims and Islam, and demanding that, quote, such bigoted and distorted materials be purged. And I would note that was their word, not mine. Purged. And is also advocating for the creation of an interagency task force to address this problem. In a lightning-quick response, a rather unusual occurrence in our bloated bureaucracy, current CIA Director John Brennan, then the President's Homeland Security Advisor, agreed to create such a task force and claimed that the federal government had indeed produced, quote, offensive training that urgently needed to be dealt with in order to, quote, reflect the vision that the President has put forward. Yet again, this subcommittee would like to discuss this critical issue of national security with the relevant officials from the Obama administration. After all, should it really be the top concern of counterterrorism whether their efforts, quote, offend anyone rather than whether they work and keep Americans safe? Yet no one from this administration is even willing to show up and defend their scrubbing of anti-terror materials. Let's take several more. In November 2011, the Department of Homeland Security released its Domestic Terrorism and Homegrown Extremism Lexicon. It made no reference to Islamic terrorism, despite being, on its face, an alleged lexicon that included anarchist extremists, animal rights extremists, environmental extremists, and racist skinhead extremists. Yet somehow, radical Islamic extremists were nowhere mentioned in the FBI's supposed lexicon. Similarly, the FBI's counterterrorism analytical lexicon makes no reference to Islam, radical Islam, jihad, or any other such term. By way of comparison, the 9/11 Commission report, released in 2004, mentioned jihad 126 times and Islam 322 times. Even worse, in March 2012, under pressure from advocacy groups, the FBI purged 876 documents from its training materials at the behest of 3 unidentified quote-unquote experts. Some of the purged materials, according to the FBI, were, and here's that word again, quote, offensive. One article was purged because it was, quote, highly inflammatory and inaccurately argued that the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization. It should come as no surprise that I and many others are concerned by this, given that I've introduced a bill in this Senate to designate the Muslim Brotherhood for what it is, a terrorist organization. Hamas, after all, is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood and is a terrorist organization that openly celebrates murdering women and children. The Obama administration, of course, has declined to appear and explain its policies. In 2014, the president stated that ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, was, quote, not Islamic. Again, the Islamic State is somehow not Islamic. Because, according to President Obama, quote, no religion condones the killing of innocents. Somehow no one has told that to the terrorists. Also in 2014, a former White House counterterrorism strategist claimed that the federal government, quote, cannot directly address the warped religious interpretations of groups like ISIL because of the constitutional separation of church and state. U.S. officials, he argued, quote, are prohibited from engaging in debates about Islam. That's more than a little troubling. Are government officials, under the terms of this administration's policy, prohibited from debating anything about Islam, from confronting Islamism, the radical theology that mandates the forcible murder or forcible submission to Sharia of the infidels? This committee deserves to hear an explanation of that. Let's finish with some more recent examples. This year alone, the Obama administration has twice purged mentions of ISIS and Islamic terrorism from highly significant public records. One involving French President Hollande's remarks about the Paris terror attacks, and the other involving the terrorist 9/11 call during the horrific Orlando attack. The administration was forced to abruptly reverse course when the public outcry became too great. Around the same time, the Homeland Security Advisory Council was admonishing DHS personnel in a report about countering violent extremism to reject, quote, religiously charged terminology such as jihad, Sharia, takfir, and ummah. Does anyone notice a trend here? A consistent effort by this administration to scrub any reference to radical Islamic terrorism, to pretend that the threat does not exist. And tragically, as a consequence of that, over and over again, we have instances where the administration has ample evidence of radical Islamic terrorists, whether it is the Boston bombers or Nidal Hassan, whether it is the terrorist in San Bernardino or the terrorist in Orlando. The administration has had over and over again ample evidence to step in and prevent these terror attacks. But the consequence of the willful blindness of a policy that, as a matter of administration policy, refuses to acknowledge the threat means over and over again this administration has allowed the threats to go forward. We cannot combat and defeat radical Islamic terrorism without acknowledging it exists and directing our resources to stopping it. And an Orwellian doublethink that seeks to excerpt any reference to it, as the administration did to the President of France, or erase pledges of allegiance to ISIS, as the administration did with the Orlando terrorist, is counterproductive to keeping this country safe. That should be the number one obligation of the Commander-in-Chief. It should be the focus of this administration, and the purpose of this subcommittee hearing is to assess the degree to which the administration is willfully turning a blind eye to radical Islamic terrorism and the consequences for the safety and security of the American people. Senator Coons.
Chairman Cruz, I appreciate this opportunity for the first hearing of this calendar year. In my view, today's hearing presents the American people with a false choice. Its very premise suggests that we can either keep America safe or preserve our fundamental values, and I reject that premise. We can and must defeat terrorism without sacrificing our constitutional principles. And to compromise these principles and blame over 1 billion Muslims for the twisted actions of an extremist few only serves to divide Americans, to alienate the Muslim world, and to legitimate the murderous groups who falsely claim to speak for Islam. This makes us less safe. To truly tackle and destroy the extremist ideologies that lead fanatics to do us harm, we will be best defended by maintaining our values of openness, tolerance, and religious freedom. We cannot fight radicalization with further radicalization. As we hold today's hearing, the country is still trying to make sense of a tragic attack in Orlando. 16 days ago, a man entered the Pulse nightclub armed with dangerous weapons and massacred 49 innocent people, injuring 50 more, leaving our nation and world shaken. These acts of violence are sadly all too familiar and leave us asking why this Congress refuses to take simple actions to prevent them. With the invited witnesses from the administration regarding their schedules, it is my expectation they are busy keeping our country safe, and as you surely appreciate from your work at the Justice Department, asking witnesses here to speak about the ongoing investigation into the Orlando incident would not have produced any productive testimony. And I will note that the Homeland Security Secretary, Jay Johnson, will be before this exact committee in 2 days, prepared to answer questions. Let me close by quoting what I've just submitted for the record, an article from General David Petraeus. Quote, "Those who flirt with hate speech against Muslims should realize they are playing directly into the hands of al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Demonizing an entire religious faith and its adherents not only runs contrary to our most cherished and fundamental values as a country, it is also corrosive to our vital national security interests and ultimately to our success in this war. I look forward to what I hope can be a productive conversation about our national security, our civil liberties, and respect for Muslim Americans. Thank you."
I thank my friend from Delaware for his comments. I would note that Senator Coons suggested that perhaps it was scheduling issues that prevented the government's witnesses from attending. This hearing was noticed two weeks ago. And indeed, just a few days ago, we received a letter from the Department of Justice that did not claim any scheduling conflicts, simply stated that the Department of Justice declined to attend. I would suggest that was not inadvertence. I would note as well that Senator Coons followed the lead of President Obama in invoking two shibboleths, neither one of which this hearing concerns. The first one, he said, is that we have no war with Islam. That is certainly correct. There are millions of peaceful Muslims across the face of the globe, and President Obama and Senate Democrats do grave disrespect to them when they suggest some sort of equivalence between peaceful Muslims and radical Islamic terrorists. To suggest that confronting radical Islamic terrorists is somehow hostile to peaceful Muslims bears no bearing on reality. I would note as well that Senator Coons, like President Obama, suggested this is just about uttering a few words, radical Islamic terrorism. No one has suggested the words radical Islamic terrorism are some magic incantation that saying them out loud will suddenly make it go away. But you cannot fight an enemy you do not acknowledge, that you pretend does not exist, and that you refuse to confront. It's not simply that President Obama, like Senate Democrats, won't say radical Islamic terrorism. It is that they have engaged in a, quote, purge to erase any focus on radical Islamic terrorism. Senator Coons mentioned a minute ago that we are, quote, still trying to make sense of the terror attack in Orlando. One is only still trying to make sense of it if one ignores the actions and words of the terrorist. A terrorist who pledged his allegiance to ISIS and whose pledge of allegiance was edited out of his 9/11 call by the Obama administration. An action that would make George Orwell proud. It only makes no sense if you do not listen to the promises to murder as many innocents as possible. And the purpose of this hearing is to focus on the connections between that policy of willful blindness of insisting there is no such thing as radical Islamic terrorism and the repeated failures of this administration to prevent terrorism. When the Orlando terrorist tells his co-workers that he's affiliated with Al-Qaeda, when the Orlando terrorist is interviewed 3 times by the FBI, when the Orlando terrorist has connections to an American suicide bomber, when the Orlando terrorist's father is publicly proclaiming on YouTube his support for the Taliban, the administration focused on fighting radical Islamic terrorism would have watched that individual very, very closely to prevent the terror attack that he was giving signal after signal after signal was a real risk. And Orlando is not the only instance. Over and over and over again, this administration has the warning signs, but because of political correctness doesn't act on them, and the result is innocent Americans are killed. Now, at this point, I would like to recognize Mr. Carlin and Mr. Steinbeck to provide their testimony, but they have refused to attend. So with that, I will invite the members of the second panel to please come forward. And each of you will be sworn in momentarily. And while you're coming forward, I will begin by introducing each of the members of the second panel. The first witness is Dr. M. Zuhdi Jasser, who is the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy in Phoenix, Arizona. A graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and the Medical College of Wisconsin, Dr. Jasser is a former commissioner of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and he served as a medical officer in the United States Navy. Dr. Jasser is currently in private practice in Phoenix, specializing in internal medicine and nuclear cardiology. Ms. Farhan Akara is the president and executive director of Muslim Advocates in Oakland, California. A graduate of Wellesley College and Cornell Law School, she has previously served as counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee and has worked as a litigation associate with several prominent Washington, D.C. law firms. Mr. Philip Haney is a former Customs and Border Protection officer in the Department of Homeland Security. Officer Haney completed several tours at the National Targeting Center near Washington, D.C., and he has won numerous awards and commendations for producing material that led to the identification of hundreds of terrorists. Having retired in July 2015, Mr. Haney now resides in Marietta, Georgia. Mr. Richard Cohen is an attorney and the president of the Southern Poverty Law Center. A graduate of Columbia University and the University of Virginia School of Law, Mr. Cohen has previously testified before the House Committee on Homeland Security and has served on the Department of Homeland Security's Countering Violent Extremism Working Group. Mr. Chris Galbutz is a businessman, activist, and national security consultant based in Franklin County, Virginia. He has spent nearly a decade researching the threat to America posed by radical Islamic terrorism and developing expertise on the network of public and private organizations that terror groups rely on for support. Mr. Michael Gurman is a fellow with the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University Law School. A graduate of Wake Forest University and Northwestern University Law School, Mr. Gurman previously worked as a special agent of the FBI. He has taught at the National Defense University, the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and spent several years with the American Civil Liberties Union's Washington Legislative Office. And Mr. Andrew McCarthy is a senior fellow at the National Review Institute and a contributing editor to National Review. A graduate of Columbia and the New York Law School, Mr. McCarthy served as a federal prosecutor for 18 years in the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. He was the lead prosecutor in the terrorism case against the so-called Blind Sheik and 11 others convicted in 1995 of conspiring to wage a war of urban terrorism against the United States. Mr. McCarthy is the author of several books on terrorism and national security. And I would ask that each of you stand and raise your right hand. Do you affirm that the testimony you are about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be seated, and you are each sworn in, and we will begin the testimony with Dr. Jasser. Please be sure to turn your microphone off by pressing the button. Thank you.
Officials are not willing to give up on America, that you will do everything in your power to uphold and defend America's defining values and principles. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Haney.
Testing. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify here today. Also, I'd like to express my appreciation for the patience of the members on the committee and Senator Coons while obtaining a copy of my written testimony. I'd like to start with a visual aid. This is the Homeland Security Advisory Council Countering Violent Extremism Subcommittee Interim Report for 2016. My colleague referred to it earlier as suggesting that we should refrain from using words like Ummah or Jihad or Sharia. I would like to also show you another visual aid, and this is what is called the Words Matter memo that was published in January of 2008. And my story today is going to be what happened between these two documents, these two touchstone documents, 2008 and 2016, because it was during that period of time that what we know now as the Countering Violent Extremism policy came to be. And one of the expressions of that policy is what we heard all about in the media in a few days after the Orlando shootings, that Attorney General Lynch was going to release partial transcript of Orlando 911 calls with all references to Islamic terrorism removed. That is a condensation of what was actually happening behind the scenes with subject matter experts like myself who were sworn officers to protect our country from threat, both foreign and domestic. Between these two dates, 2008 and 2016, came what I call the first great purge, when I was ordered by the Department of Homeland Security headquarters to modify, a euphemism, removing all linking information out of approximately 820 text subject records in our law enforcement system that almost exclusively had to do with Muslim Brotherhood Network here in the United States. I was told to remove all unauthorized references to terrorism, that I was no longer allowed to do what are called memorandums of information received, what we call MOIRs, no more text records, no more research, and no more special treatment from the agency. But during that time, hundreds of law enforcement actions had been taken in the 3-year period when those 820 plus records were still in the law enforcement system. At exactly the same time, a controversial inaugural meeting took place on January 27th and 28th, 2010 between American Muslim leaders and the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Janet Napolitano, which was hosted by the Department of Homeland Security Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. It was controversial because several of the individuals attended the invitation-only conference in D.C. were known affiliates of at least 2 of the same Muslim Brotherhood front groups that had just been named as unindicted co-conspirators in the largest terrorism trial in the history of the United States, the Holy Land Foundation trial. Also that spring, at least 6 individuals with known affiliations to the Muslim Brotherhood front groups were appointed to the Countering Violent Extremism CVE Working Group, which was convened under the authority of the Homeland Security Advisory Council. I would like to show you now the logo of the Muslim Brotherhood, the moderate organization that this administration chose to ally itself with. Across the middle it says Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, which means the brothers of the Muslim, or the Muslim Brotherhood. And at the bottom, taken from Quran 860, is the word Wa'ayuda, which means prepare yourselves to terrify your adversaries with steeds of war or weapons of war. That is the motto of the Muslim Brotherhood. By the spring of 2010, we had come to the point that a CBP officer was literally linking information, meaning the dots, on Muslim Brotherhood-linked individuals from text, while the administration was bringing the very same individuals into positions of influence to help create and implement our counterterrorism policy, both in the domestic arena and in the foreign policy arena, as evidenced in our overt support of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Libya, Algeria, and Syria. Fast forward to August 30, 2011, when the Tablighi Jamaat court case that I worked on was approved by the Chief Counsel of the Department of Homeland Security. And this is an icon of the Tablighi Jamaat movement. One of the largest in the world outside of the United States is called the Army of Darkness. I began a TDY assignment, meaning temporary duty, at the National Targeting Center in November of 2011. Within 6 months, we had instituted 1,200 law enforcement actions on the case that we had started. But in September of 2012, what I call the second Great Purge, when the administration removed 67 linking records out of that case that had direct ties both to the San Bernardino Mosque, Darul Uloom al-Islamiyah San Bernardino, and the Islamic Center of Fort Pierce down in Florida. In other words, the network that we had worked on at NTC is tied directly to the terrorist attacks that we've seen recently. At the end of my career, I was relieved of my service weapon. All access to text was cut off and suspended. My secret clearance was revoked, and I was sequestered for 11 months while the results of 3 simultaneous investigations from 3 different branches of the government were concluded. In July of 31 of last year, I retired honorably. In conclusion, the threat of Islamic terrorism does not just come from a network of armed organizations such as Hamas and ISIS, who are operating over there somewhere in the Middle East. In fact, branches of the same global network have been established here in America, and they are operating in plain sight, especially among those of us who have been charged with the duty